Yeah, so just to sort of reiterate, I think I said it in the video, I think I said it earlier today, this morning. Um, the Atlas project was to create the contextual data for the 10 collections that we were working on in Oceanic Exchanges. And Oceanic Exchanges was looking specifically at text reprinting and concept or semantic drift, which is sort of the ideas moving from place to place over the 19th century within those 10 collections. But we really want the Atlas to be something that is continuing to expand going in the future, and something that is more representative. So in terms of what collections do you think are particularly apt to include in something like the Atlas that you would like to see? Also, what sorts of things, features or ways of going about documentation, things that you've seen in other collections that maybe should be more broadly known, more broadly taken up? Or is there something in our Atlas that you have any questions about, or are there any sections, especially to our database histories, that didn't answer your questions? Is there something you really would have liked to have comparable data about these different collections that we didn't think of? Is there a subheading that was missing? So that's a lot of topics for discussion, but feel free to raise your hand or to jump in the deafening silence that I'm sure that will occur for 30 seconds, or type something in the chat. So what did you think about what is in the Atlas, missing from the Atlas, would you like to see going forward? And why people are typing away as I see they are. I'll just make a quick note to Hannah's point about some of the digitization. There are certain issues on the Google News digitized newspaper where they're obviously editor copies because there are letters written in the side margins of some of the newspapers, because it was free for newspaper editors to post newspaper copies to each other to promote cut and paste journalism. So some of the new Google digitized from microfilm versions actually have these lovely letters from editors to each other, kind of written in half code. And there's no way to find out where these are or tell people about them in a very specific way. So that kind of marginalia is something that I would love to see an additionality, like what are additions, which version of the text was digitized, is something I would really love to see in collections in some sort of metadata field.
And following on from that point, I think I mentioned it in one of the videos that many collections digitize a particular edition of the day. So it's normally the evening edition, they just do the one edition. So if you're interested in morning editions and other editions during the day, they're often not there. But it's also often not clear if they are there or not, because some collections have a policy of just having that evening edition, but they do still contain or still have some of the other editions as well. So I talked a bit about that in the video, but I think it's something that collections could make clearer for people to use. In terms of features in other collections that I like, again, I think I mentioned it in the video that the Impresso project has imported from libraries, and this, so the Luxembourg Impresso newspapers has a thing about the political affiliation of their newspapers, where it's available. And sometimes it's really weirdly specific because it's drawn from what the newspaper says about itself and what the library says. So it's a really variable field, but that kind of information being part of the metadata is really, really useful. In the chat, we've got a comment from Sinai that says there's a wide international collection that they would very much like to include, and that's JPress, the Jewish Historical Press Platform, which would be brilliant, definitely, to widen the more Anglophone focus.
Absolutely, and the point from Nicola as well about data visualizations, and I think, I apologize, I can't remember who said it now, one of the groups was talking about the idea of helping startup collections or people who wanted to start up. And I think that's something that we didn't have enough time and maybe data to put together, but going forward with the Atlas, we wanted to hold a couple more workshops with collection holders or people who are intimately connected with collections, to see about like what would be a great procedure, what would be something that would be a how-to digitize, meet metadata standards, provide user feedback, and sort of a how-to guide. And I think that's something that the Atlas could make available with the support of the community that I would love to see. And absolutely doing it with visualizations is something that I would very much appreciate. I am a visual thinker myself, so.
Christine says a how-to on digitization would be awesome. So there's a question from John. Is there any consideration of the number and distribution of newspapers not digitized, and any way to think about the gaps in digitization through the Atlas? And certainly in the database histories, so for every database we have a history that includes the selection, and the selection both of the physical collection that's being digitized and then how they started the digitization. So for example, the British Library collection tried to digitize a kind of politically representative balance. And because there were more liberal newspapers, it means digitizing more of the smaller number of conservative newspapers to create political balance. And obviously, as over time, as the collections expand, these things become less of a defining feature because more things are digitized. Again, I'm just going to evangelize the Impresso project as one, but not the only one, that has a visualization of the issues they have and what they're missing. There are other collections that also do this, but Impresso make it quite prominent that you can look at the newspapers and there's a chart showing what's missing and what is included.
I was just noticing the idea about a subheading about documentation and what is available there. That's actually a really excellent point that maybe the digital version would be the best place to put that, actually, is a list of hyperlinks or catalog entries for, we found quite a lot of collections. The best documentation we could find were actually issues of the International Library Association's conference proceedings. These were sometimes incredibly detailed and really honest. I have to say, I really loved some of the conference proceedings from this. And we did try to provide a bibliography, but I can see how having a crowdsourced list, much like the Wikipedia list of digitized newspapers, a crowdsourced list of documentation for these collections would be something that a lot of people could easily contribute and could keep up to date, but would still be super valuable.
Patrick says in Germany, the National Library are building a national newspaper portal to bring together the various German historical newspapers, and they'd like to collaborate on the Atlas as well. Richard says it would be great in the Atlas to expand the date range and the range of databases. He says he put a list of titles with links online years ago, breaking down the titles embedded in the collections, and there are printed copies, probably retained for tax purposes, which provide considerable insight, such as the Edinburgh Evening Current archive. David notes the point about political alignments as a minefield, because with commercial freelance newspapers, there's a range of contributors and so on. Yeah, and I think that's something that I really felt from working with the metadata and thinking about how the newspaper changed over time, which we tried to capture in the Atlas in describing the history, is that a lot of the metadata applies to a newspaper title as a whole, and it doesn't give space for how things may have changed over time. And you can see that cropping up in, for example, a different edition. So a Sunday edition of a newspaper, it does start out with a strong relationship to the parent, but then it might essentially become a separate newspaper. And does that then become a separate newspaper under a different title? How do you retain the link to the parent title? How do you show the change from titles of articles to headlines as they become bigger and spatial features? So it would be great to find a way for metadata to accommodate changes over time. But again, we're putting a lot of pressure on what the metadata can contain to do that.
Yeah, and I think to follow up on that, there was a lovely account in Trove of the Bulletin, which definitely starts off newspaper-like, as much as you can say that for any 19th century periodical, and becomes much more magazine-like in the 20th century. But it was a newspaper, so that's how it was cataloged, so that's how it goes into the newspaper collection in Trove. And there's so many things, especially with the 19th and early 20th century, where newspapers are hard to pin down what exactly a newspaper is. So it's interesting. The idea of having issue by issue contextual metadata is something that I think most people would love. And it's a matter of how do we collaborate effectively to allow that with some degree of editorial oversight, with some degree of consistency, but without overworking any one group of people too much. Okay, so I think what we'll shift now for just a few minutes then is really our vision for the Atlas going forward in the future, and what we would like to hear from you in general. So the Atlas was never meant to be a grand search engine for going across all different collections. It was meant to be a central repository for documentation. And although the project has concluded now, because we're using GitHub, which promotes open source and crowdsourcing of content, even with my limited amount on my work plan, so to speak, to continue working on this going in the future, we really would like to see it expand significantly over the next few years. So what lessons have you guys in your various aspects of your work learned about digital newspaper collections? What sort of things is this Atlas useful for? And has it sort of changed your mind about how you're going to work with your digital collections? Basically, I'm asking, is the Atlas useful to you, and in what way is it useful to you?
So I've put in an application for some Australian Research Council funding that is looking at digitizing children's periodicals, because that's my main point of interest. So, you know, there's a few periodicals like in the 19th century UK database, and then there's some stuff in Trove, but that's mostly children's pages and stuff. So for me, frankly, while I was watching your videos and looking at the Atlas today, I was like, well, you guys have done all the hard yards in terms of, I mean, I've not done this before. I've used databases, but haven't digitized anything. So I'm kind of grateful to be able to come back to the Atlas as a place where you've kind of done the comparative work to just figure out how it is that we would go about doing our own digitization. So I'd be really kind of interested, and that's why I was excited about the how-to, the idea of a how-to, because, you know, there obviously are a number of people who have done really important work in terms of figuring out how to do this. I don't want to do that work. I want to just gather the children's periodicals so it becomes a resource for other people, but I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. So, you know, figuring out what resources are there that I can use in a very self-interested kind of way, but then is also the sort of working towards those standards so that it can, you know, respond to so many of the concerns that have been addressed in the workshop. Seems like this really kind of fabulous opportunity. So this has been fabulous, and I appreciate your time getting us all organized.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I think Sinai wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I mean, I want to also thank you for this. I mean, the report is amazing. It's a lot of information that I really needed, and I think it's particularly useful for attempts to represent the data in other ways that might be necessary. For example, we were thinking about a TEI module to represent newspapers, which is obviously not what libraries should be working on, but scholars are sometimes interested in working on TEI, and we were wondering, a group of us, for a long time, how do we encode the structures in between our languages, and and there was a lot of very helpful information in the report, and of course there's more. I would welcome more discussion on that in the future, especially the content section in the report.
So just the comment in there, I'll second this argument. Inga says, my experience of planning digitization work, finding the pitfalls and the prior is very valuable. And I think just from my own experience, I did come at this as a historian who used digital newspapers, and getting immersed in the idea of the workflow that goes into creating these digital resources, how many hands take place, are working on these things, was an amazing experience for me to just, I thought of ways of using newspapers that I never would have before had I not done the research. So it's been very, very useful for me as a historian to actually look at the histories of these archives and to actually learn about the metadata that exists and doesn't exist. Because I, like many people, thought there was this magical cache of metadata that existed that I just didn't have access to. And I realized that there's a lot more responsibility on people like myself to maybe make that metadata and make it available.
And to think of that as well, that metadata, as we're not going to get these huge collections of millions of pages to redo the metadata of what they've done. It doesn't make sense, because there's more stuff that constantly needs to be digitized. And as somebody said, archivists have other stuff to do. So we appreciate that. And I think it's finding ways of working with these collections that doesn't lose the granularity, the detail that's in some of them, in an effort to work across them. You don't want to reduce them all to the minimum metadata to make it possible to have one database to rule them all, because you still want to have those quirks and those things that, as people have said, within a specific collection is useful to researchers that might not apply to another collection, and depends on who you're making it for and who's using it. So we can talk about the kinds of things that collections, that researchers might want to do with collections, but that's going to be different for different collections, and it's going to lead to different metadata. It's never going to be one type of metadata for every collection.
And I can see a hand from Nicola.
Hi, I'm a little bit out of my depth here because I'm not a historian, but I just wanted to say a little bit about in favour of libraries not just leaving everything the way they are, because I think there's certainly an awareness that you might be able to have a huge impact by running a better OCR tool across a huge data set, and that might actually have more impact than 100 people working on crowdsourcing. And for me, the issue is not to lose the second one if you are able to take advantage of the first one, because as tools become more sophisticated and available and cheaper, and more AI projects or machine learning projects are undertaken, I think libraries are open to the capacity for revisiting and improving our offerings. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Yeah, I completely agree. I think because I had the somewhat unique experience of traveling around in 2018 and a bit in 2019 and staying at some of these libraries, just to get to see the immense amount of work that was being done by such a small team in some cases. And it just impressed upon me how thankful I am that work was being done, and not to be quite as entitled as perhaps I had been previously as a researcher, but really wanting to give back and to improve the community of knowledge. And I think the more that we can work together as data scientists, information scientists, librarians, archivists, historians, literary scholars, and family historians, some of whom understood these databases way better than I did, just because of the level of detail they were doing for their genealogical work. So the more people who can contribute to our collective understanding of types of research questions and types of access, the better I think we'll all be. Before we go into our final discussion, though, I did want to address 2 points that were brought up before in the first plenary and in one of the groups. The first one, Eileen asked about the difference between the front and the back end of these collections, and I think it sort of feeds into the general purpose of the atlas for different groups, which came up in some of the different subgroups. So we had really fortunate access to all 10 of these collections. Gail Cengage was very generous and gave us multiple copies of their hard drives for us to look through the British Library newspapers. The other newspaper catalogs all either sent us direct download links or sent hard drives to various team members in Oceanic exchanges that we were able to combine. Trove, we had to use the API to download as well because they weren't able to do the hard drive for us, but National Library of New Zealand was able to give hard drives. And I would say that with the exemption of Gale, all of these hard drives are accessible to any researcher who wants to ask. It really is a matter of just asking the digitization team the way to get it, whether that's direct download or getting hard drives, or doing it through the API in the case of Trove. The only one that is not open access, or the only two that are not open access is Gale, which if your library subscribes to the Gale collection, you can purchase the hard drives. They're not super cheap, but they do make them available. And the Mexican collections, which are at the moment only available on site because they're still being developed. They've not been fully completed yet. So those will probably grow in the future. So I would have to say that there is a big difference between the front end and the back end though. There is just simply more data available on the hard drives than is made available through the interfaces. And that is largely because of an attempt by the libraries or the commercial publishers to make things simpler. They genuinely believe that having a simple Google search bar, and that's it, is the way most people want to interact with their collections. We got this explicitly from people like ProQuest and Redex as well. So my suggestion would be, if you want more of the data, we have tried to map out everything that is already technically available in the atlas. Go to these libraries, go to these collection holders, and try to ask for the raw data. And in most cases, you'll be able to get it one way or the other, especially if you have a case for what you're using it, as opposed to, I just want the hard drive, please. If you have a project, funded or not, but if you have a purpose for it, they're more likely to get it to you quickly. Question here, British Library newspapers, British Newspaper Archive. Okay, so the British Library did their initial digitization with Gale Cengage for British Library newspapers 1 and 2. They later created a partnership with Find My Past to do later runs of it, and that became the British Newspaper Archive. The British Newspaper Archive does include the initial run, and Gale does use some of the British Newspaper Archive in their collections. They have agreements going back and forth, but they have different names because they have different commercial partners, and that is a great simplification, but there is documentation available on it. But basically, the original 2 runs of digitization were made free to UK universities, and that's why we tend to distinguish them from the rest of the collection, because the UK university system helped fund those first 2 versions. Yes, the British Newspaper Archive is part of the wider Find My Past genealogy service, so it has a lot more newspapers integrated into it. Okay, so in terms of the atlas, just really briefly on what it's for, the main point, yes, thank you, Rosita, for clarifying that. The main point of the atlas was threefold, and that's why we invited the 3 groups here. The first, the metadata maps, are for data scientists or people who are interested in manipulating the data directly, so that you would have the specific names of the specific XML fields to get exactly the data you want across all of these collections. That's who that part of the atlas is for. For more general researchers, we hoped that understanding what fields are available in which collections would help you understand what kind of research questions you could make viable with these different collections, especially if there's data that exists but isn't in the front end. So you'd be able to say, oh, well, I can't find this in the advanced search box, but I know because of the atlas it exists, so I can liaise with the library and see if I can get that data. And finally, we really hoped that having comparable data for the database histories, just to understand on a broad sense of how things were selected, how things were funded, how things are made available, would be useful to understand the wider landscape of newspaper digitization, so people don't not just naively go in and think that the databases are complete, but to have a documented understanding of what specifically they have or don't have, as opposed to a general sense that I know they're not complete. So that's sort of the use cases for the Atlas. But what I'd like to open this last discussion up for is, we've talked quite a lot a bit about wish lists and things that we kind of would hope would exist. But what I'd really like to put to you guys is, in terms of the Atlas, in terms of a central repository for metadata maps, for database histories, for glossaries of understanding how these terms are used in different disciplines and by journalists and by digitization providers, what did you find useful in the Atlas? What would you find useful if we updated it or expanded it? Where would you like to see it go? So this is really your chance to say, my ideal Atlas would include this. So I think for me, just what people are starting to write things in the text box, the thing I really love about the Atlas that I would like to see expanded is this idea of language definitions and language variants. It is sadly slightly Anglophone at the moment, just because Emily and I were the main editors. So having a much broader range of what these terms mean in different languages and how they're used in different languages, and how that relates to the context of a Dutch newspaper or a Australian newspaper or a Chinese newspaper, I think would make it just that much more useful a document. So that's one thing I would really hope people feel they would like to contribute in the future. Making it worldwide, Marie says, yes, absolutely. Numa Press is a wonderful, and I very much would like to work with them to bringing Francophone newspapers in. Unfortunately, we didn't have any colleagues from French universities on the particular project, so we didn't have access to those at the time. And the Francophone world is so rich for these different types of newspapers that it would be really useful to include them, absolutely. I'll hand over to Emily for a second because I need to take a drink of water.
Okay, following on from what Melody said about in terms of using the Atlas, one example that I think I mentioned in the videos, but I always come back to, is the idea of an edition and what editions are in collections. So looking at the database history, for example, the British Library, you can find out that they generally only have the evening edition digitized in their collections, but not uniformly. They do sometimes have other editions. But because a lot of these collections have digitized one edition per day, if you're looking for morning editions, they're probably not there. And a lot of them don't have fields for that. So that edition field sometimes contains something about that, but it also has things like the Sydney edition of a newspaper versus a Melbourne edition of a newspaper. So by looking at which collections have editions, you might think you could compare them. By looking at what the history and the development of the term and how it's used across the collections, you might find it's more geographic edition rather than daily edition. And by looking at the database history, you'll see which editions they are actually committed to digitizing and providing. We've got a few questions in the chat. Paul asks, what body could possibly advocate for transnational compatibility, let alone transnational open access and copyright advocacy? Is there an international network of newspaper librarians? Why does there appear to be no discussion or interface among national collections? And is there a political imperative to reinvent the wheel at a national scale? And that is something that we did find, isn't it, Melody, that it's national collections, these places are funded, often created by government legislation to preserve a kind of national heritage. But there are projects like Europeana that is deliberately aggregating collections from within Europe to try and have that thing. So there are international networks, but there are different stages in different places.
One thing I would say is that for our research, the IFLA, their conference proceedings were basically the main source for sort of tracking the history of these programs, because they were often work in progress conference papers. So it was really helpful. And it's clear from those, at least to me, and I'm sure the librarians in the room can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a huge amount of collaboration and knowledge sharing and saying, this is how we did it, this is how we think it works, how did you do that? And they do try to share, but there are different funding models, there are different government priorities attached to those funding models. And also, I would say not to forget the huge role in standardization or non-standardization that outsourcing to not necessarily commercial providers like Gale or Redex, but outsourcing to the actual photographers of the documents and the people who do the basic layout metadata. Those often get outsourced to a couple big commercial providers, and they set the parameters for how the metadata gets set, not the libraries. So on the one hand, that standardizes it, but not necessarily in the way librarians or historians or family scholars would do it. So I think there should be more advocacy. Maybe we can promote that by providing support to these librarians. I would love to include case studies. If anybody uses the Atlas in any way, shape, or form, we will highlight you and share your research far and wide. So please do send case studies.
And thank you, Paul, for sharing one of the blog posts, because we did put together a few blog posts that tried to give a few kind of insights into ways that you might use it. So I did write one on front pages comparing how you might think about what the fields tell you about page position, columns, and things like that to think about the layout of the newspaper, as somebody in one of the groups mentioned.
In terms of tutorials for using the Atlas, yes, we absolutely intend to do that. We're going to make a couple of, or I'm going to make a couple of videos on using the Atlas and also on how to contribute to the Atlas, whether that's historical context, glossary entries, or adding new databases and new database histories. We're going to make shorter, more simple, straightforward videos and share those on the same playlist and on the Atlas to hopefully make it a lot more accessible to people who don't want to just sort of explore it. You know, our project funding expires soon, but are you planning more events like this workshop? Yes, so we will definitely be having at least one more workshop this autumn, where it will be an online Zoom workshop for more practical uses. So maybe we could separate that into using it as a historical researcher or using it as a contributor. We also have some funding to do face-to-face workshops and conference attendance, which we're currently in the process of organizing. And if there are any libraries that would like to invite us to do hands-on workshops, we would be very happy to, you know, air travel permitting or Zoom permitting, love to do workshops with individual libraries. Yes, the non-textual elements, thank you, Laura. There is a lot of research that's currently being done on the non-textual elements, which we did not have the capacity to do ourselves in terms of constructing it, because we wanted to make it comparable across databases, and we didn't have a lot of information about that yet. But if that is something that there is a demand for, it's probably something that we can collaborate with a wide range of academics and others to sort of see if we can piece together not an appendix, but adding to the individual entries the relevant visual or masthead kind of information. Particularly things like advertisements and ephemera as well that sadly don't always get digitized. In the last 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to sort of tell you what we're planning to do going forward in a bit more detail with this particular workshop and in the future. The Atlas is going to be run principally by me going forward, but it is on GitHub, which is an open, accessible, collaborative environment, which means that individuals who want to make any changes to the Atlas, add a paragraph, correct a link, add a foreign language example to some of our glossary entries, there's a very simple process for doing that that's fairly automated. So that means the Atlas can keep growing with a minimal amount of overhead from me. And I will be posting videos on how to do all of those different types of edits. If in the end you have contextual information or glossary entries and you really just, you can't handle it on GitHub and you want to send me a Word document with that information, I'm very happy to accept that as well. We want to make this as much a community project as we possibly can. And yeah, I think that's the main takeaways I wanted to have from this workshop. Emily, is there anything that I'm forgetting, as I usually do?
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, as Melody says, we'd love to hear from people. If you've got collections you're working on that you think might want to be added, or if you want to talk about how you might develop something similar for a different kind of collection, we'd be very pleased to hear from you as well. In our workshop yesterday, we had people talking about the Jewish newspaper collections and things like this. So yeah, that would be brilliant.
Great, thank you, Emily. So I guess I will stay here for a few minutes after the workshop if people have specific questions or they want to ask things or anything like that. But I mean, we put on this workshop for you guys, but really you have been an enormous amount of help to Emily and I, and really just understanding, you know, what is needed in these communities and how this kind of work going forward could actually be the most useful it could be. So thank you very much for all your contributions and spending your morning, afternoon, evening, or very late at night, wherever you are, with 2 hours with us.
Thank you.